Hey channel, Fernando from SkyFi Audio. It's finally here. I've been waiting for this product for decades. It is the McIntosh MQ112 environmental equalizer, and I finally have a chance to share this piece with you guys, so I'm super excited. In this video, we're going to do a bunch of things. We're going to dive in pretty deep. We're going to go over the features of the equalizer, who should own it, what's the right client for this piece, because it's not for everybody. How to connect it to your system. There are a couple options, and there are some good practices or best practices around that. What it will do to your music and to your system and to your room. We're going to have a really cool interview with Ken Zelin from McIntosh Labs, who's an expert in this topic. So we're going to do a Zoom call with him to go over the development and some of the tips and tricks around this piece. Then we're going to crack it open. At the end of the video, we're going to crack this thing open, see how it's made, see what the engineering looks like. And then we're going to hook it up to some test equipment and measure some things. I'm going to illustrate to you what happens to a signal as you sort of turn these knobs and dials and how it affects your music. So hang in there. This is going to be a long one. I think the interview alone is around 30 minutes. I'm probably going to babble on for another 30 minutes. So let's dive right in. The MQ112 is becoming one of their best-selling pieces. So let's talk about how to acquire one, because I know a lot of you are going to want one of these beauties. So McIntosh products are sold through local authorized dealers, and I encourage you to please support your local dealer. They make a heavy investment in the brand and the support structure around it, and that's really where the business should be going. This is not a product that can be shipped. Please do not call us asking us to break rules or to get creative around how to get this to you. It is an in-store purchase only. If you're in the tri-state area, please visit us and make an appointment at skyfiaudio.com. If you're outside of our area, support your local dealer. There is a dealer locator on McIntosh's website where you can find out who it is. Let's talk about the basics. So the MQ112 is an 8-band environmental equalizer, and you can kind of count the bands here that are lined up from lowest frequency to highest frequencies. There is a tilt button here that we'll talk about, which is pretty cool. An EQ control. This allows you to engage and disengage this from your signal path, and then some power control here on the right. So in terms of operation, although it has a bunch of buttons and it might look overwhelming, it's pretty simple. Now this is different than the equalizers that you're used to. McIntosh has always used a rotary controller for that purpose, while you're used to probably seeing sliders and faders to do the same function. It is also a single, even though it's a stereo unit, there is controls for just left and right together. You cannot control left and right channel independently. That's a much different kind of pro audio equalizer that this is not. This is meant for a consumer, and this is meant to go in someone's home. In the most basic form, we have divided the entire audible spectrum into 8 bands, 25 hertz being the lowest, all the way up to 10K. So this is right about the limit, or just below the limit of the auditory, sort of what people can hear. Mid-range would be around the 400 to 1K region, and then the low and low bass on the left side. So essentially, as you turn up these knobs, you get more bass. As you turn up these knobs, you get more treble, and the inverse of that as well. It'll attenuate as well. So you would typically just set this to your liking. And historically, people have used equalizers to just dial in a set of speakers. In other words, to get the most out of a pair of speakers in a specific environment. But this is kind of intended a little differently, and we've been talking a lot about sort of using this unit to kind of manipulate your music and the recording quality. Some recordings are lacking certain areas, and some have too much of something, so it's essentially a great way to tame a recording as much as it is a way to dial in a room. When you look at this great chart that McIntosh has provided for us, it's broken down. Here are the knobs, the 8 knobs at the bottom, and it's broken down by instruments, where a singing voice, for example, a soprano would sit. If you wanted to massage that particular voice, you would mess around with the 200, 400, and 1K knobs. And all the way down from flutes and bassoons and tubas, and then drums and all that. So I kind of would like you guys to imagine using the equalizer as a manipulation of instruments and voices rather than the room. And over here it shows you what the tilt control does, which is that knob that I mentioned a bit ago. It's sitting right over here. It's quite a clever piece, and I'll show you later. I've got an oscilloscope here and a frequency generator. I'm going to show you what the tilt does visually, but it essentially can embellish either the lower side of the frequency range or the higher frequency range by turning either clockwise or counterclockwise. So this is a cool feature that you don't quite see on equalizers nowadays. Now, if what you're looking to ultimately do is correct your room, this is not the right product for it. McIntosh makes something much, much better, the MQ112. It's a computerized room corrector with a microphone where you go around the room in your favorite listening positions and you play a bunch of test signals over your loudspeakers, and the microphone picks up those signals and adjusts all sorts of settings, not just frequency response, but also phasing and volume levels throughout the spectrum. So if you're looking to solve a problem with a room, whether it's lopsided or you've got too many different surfaces or it's not working for you, I encourage you to look at that product. I'll put a link below for it. But again, this is more geared towards someone that is trying to do one of two things: either compensate for shortcomings in recording qualities, or, which is what we sort of see it mostly used for, getting more out of vintage speakers. Us at SkyFi Audio, we love vintage speakers. We sell a ton of them, stuff from the 60s, 70s, and 80s. And, a lot of them are very good at some things, but come short in other things. So an equalizer allows us to essentially correct for those things independently of the room. So if we've got a speaker from the 60s that we're just not getting enough bass out of, we may be able to correct it by tweaking some of these knobs here on the left. Carefully, of course, that we don't exceed the capabilities of the drivers, but you can do a lot with a vintage amplifier by manipulating some of the things. And that's why equipment back in the 50s, 60s, and 70s had bass and treble controls, which seems to have disappeared from the world. So, and I want to pose that question to you guys. Is an equalizer, still relevant by today's standards? Do we want equalizers in an audiophile system? A lot of people say no tone controls, no equalizers, but I don't know, there's a bunch of different opinions on this, and I'd love to hear what you think. Does this really detract from the audiophile experience? And in a product like this that can be so brilliantly engaged and disengaged, can you have best of both worlds? So please leave a comment below. Let me know if you're thumbs up or thumbs down on equalizers altogether. So on the left here, we talked about these EQ control. This is essentially a way to engage and disengage this piece from your signal path. And there are three settings for this. One is via a 12-volt trigger. There is a facility in the back to connect a power control cable, so you can enable and disable this unit from your remote control if you've got a McIntosh system, which is absolutely brilliant. I love that feature. I don't like to get up from my listening chair to make changes. And being able to defeat these completely is exactly what I would want. And then the out is just a manual way of achieving removal of the signal path, and then in is essentially engaged. And we got a little red light here when we engage it. We talked about the tilt control, which I will show you a bit later visually. That'll help you really understand what it does. And then over here we've got, and sorry for the glare, all the McIntosh stuff is so hard to pick up on camera, but here we've got a power button, and this is consistent throughout the McIntosh product line, where you've got essentially an off button with a little red standby light, and the remote is how you set it if you want to control its power stage from another piece of McIntosh gear. So that if, for example, I turn on my preamp, this will turn on automatically through that 12-volt trigger if I've got this set to remote. And if you don't have McIntosh and you just want to do manual power, here it is, on right here. And now let's look at the connections. On the left, we've got a standard IAC removable power cord. You can see this machine is set for 120 volts for the US market, and it can run 50 and 60 hertz. We've got a button here, essentially a switch, that allows us to enable and disable the auto off. Now, through some legislature, we have now all these electronic components that need to shut off automatically if they're not being used. Becomes quite a bit of a nuisance, especially in McIntosh, because if this guy shuts off automatically, it's going to shut off all the other McIntosh equipment down the chain. So it's quite annoying for Mac gear. I'm glad they didn't put a secret button push for this. We've got our actual real switch in the back. So we usually set this to disable. Power control in and out. This is the 12-volt triggers that I mentioned before that lets you power this unit on and off from another piece. And then the trigger to enable and disable it, in other words, to bypass or keep it in the signal path, is done through this port. And then we've got a ton of inputs and outputs, and this is where it gets really interesting. We've got both balanced and single-ended inputs and 2 parallel sets of outputs in both XLR and RCA, and the ability to switch between mono and stereo for the subwoofer. So this gives us a ton of options, especially since all inputs and outputs are active at all times, meaning that I can feed in a RCA or unbalanced signal in here and come out of either single-ended or XLR. I mean, balanced. There's tons of options here for bi-amping and hooking up subwoofers and tape loops and stuff. So we'll talk a bit more about how to connect this thing, but I just wanted to point out that we've got 1 set of inputs and 2 sets of outputs for ultimate flexibility. So the case is a typical McIntosh affair. We've got a glass front panel that keeps things from aging, and backlit as we've always expect. Typical aluminum end caps on it. Now the chassis is just a black painted chassis. We don't see the high polished stainless steel at this level, and it is their smaller form factor and probably about 4.5, 5 inches tall. Now all those connection options allows this piece to really be used with 2 completely different types of clients. We've got the vintage client that might have a C28 or an early preamp that has only RCA outputs and is looking to get a bit more out of the vintage speakers. This will blend perfectly into the system. Not only that, it'll create a really nice upgrade path because let's say that same client has a later MC275 amplifier with XLR inputs. Since this will convert from RCA to XLRs, then this can essentially improve the connection between the preamp and the amplifier. On the other side, we've got the modern clients that have preamps from McIntosh and wish they had an equalizer in them. Well, guess what? This is a perfect path for that person that has a C2700 tube preamp and wishes that it had a built-in equalizer like some of the other solid-state preamps from McIntosh. This would be a perfect addition. And of course, to go with the C12000 preamp, their flagship 2-piece preamp, this would be a stunning addition to that. I did a review on that piece not long ago. I'll put a link below if you want to see an in-depth review. Now, this is not the first equalizer that McIntoshes make. If you go back in time, and particularly the MQ112 comes to mind, I just listed one on our website, skyfiaudio.com. It was quite different. The intent was a bit different, where it was meant to go with their speakers to do what I said earlier, to get a little bit more performance out of them. The drivers weren't as capable as they are today, so oftentimes tone controls would be used in order to embellish the sound, and that's what the MQ112 was for. There were other ones in the lineup, but nothing in terms of external with a parametric or environmental equalizer like this, so we're super glad to see this. All right, now let's look at how to connect this thing. Go to our website, and if you click on the MQ112, you'll get to our product page here where we've got a link to the manual. So down below a bit, you've got the manual, and there's always illustrations on all the McIntosh manuals on how to connect things, which is super helpful. And here's option number 1. This is between the preamp and the power amp, and this is the preferred method to do so. So you've got at the top, this is the preamplifier. It looks like maybe a C2700 or something similar. Then we've got the equalizer here, and then we've got an amplifier down below. So in this case, we've gone output with XLRs into the input, and then output from the equalizer into the amplifier. Pretty straightforward. And then in addition, we talked about those power control cables that are essentially connecting the 3 pieces together so that when the preamp goes on, both the equalizer and the amplifier goes on. This is preferred not only in terms of performance, but also this is the best way to integrate a subwoofer into the setup so that when you bypass the equalizer, the subwoofer is still in place. Now, in a processor loop, you're essentially sending the signal from the preamp to the equalizer, then back into the preamp before then going to the amplifier. So a bit different. in terms of execution and connections, you're going to need for that a processor or a preamp or an integrated amp that has both inputs and outputs, essentially a loop, a processor loop. So here you see the output going into the equalizer, then going back into the preamp, and then the regular connection between the preamp and the amplifiers you had before. Power control stays all the same. Now let's see if we can visualize what happens as we manipulate the tone controls in an equalizer. I got a very simple setup here. This is not my test bench. This is a temporary system I put together for this video. I've got a function generator, entry-level function generator that can do a bunch of different types of waves. I've got a battery-powered oscilloscope, and of course the equalizer down below. I've set a 1000 hertz signal of a sine wave that's essentially going to the inputs on the equalizer and then going to the oscilloscope. So as if I start manipulating the knobs, especially on the tilt side, you can start to see how it affects it. Now I am at 1000 hertz, right? So in essence, the 1K knob is the one that should have the biggest impact on the sine wave. So if I turn the 1K knob, you can see the level changes and diminishes quite a bit. Now if I flank the 1K, I should still see an impact, but not as dramatic as before. Why? Because it's not a notch filter where we're just essentially manipulating just one frequency. There's quite a few of them, or the surrounding frequencies being affected as well. And that's illustrated in their manual. Over here, as you can see, the 1K here, starts to ramp up significantly around 300 hertz and doesn't really come back down until around 3K. So even the 3K will see an impact on this. So if we look at our diagram here, a 1 kilohertz manipulation is right in the middle of a clarinet and a flute and a soprano. So you get a sense of the range. Now, if I change this to a lower frequency, let's go to, let's say 50 hertz. Okay, I'll have to auto set the equalizer and the oscilloscope. And now if I manipulate the 50 hertz knob, I can see quite a bit of an impact on it. And even at 25 hertz. Okay, this is not the best setup, right? Using an oscilloscope and it's not as accurate as using a spectrum analyzer or a frequency analyzer where you can see all the frequencies at all the times, but this is good enough to give you an illustration how it matches the diagram. But if we go to a square wave, for example, all right, so I've set the frequency generator to 200 hertz and a square wave, and you can see here, and as I manipulate, let's say the 1K right here, it's a good way to see what happens to the wave. You can see the left side kind of gets peaky and the right side begins to drop. And if I lower the 1K, you can see it rounds off the left side of the wave, which is kind of cool. It's much easier to visualize than it is with a sine wave at this point. And now looking at the tilt function, I'm tilting to the right now. In other words, I'm raising the high frequencies, and you can see the effect. And now I'm doing the opposite to the left. So, and lastly, to show the EQ control, let's say I tilt high frequencies here. You can see it on the analyzer, and then if I go to the out, it completely bypasses, and we're back to just a pure square wave. So engaged and disengaged. And again, this can be controlled from a remote control, which is a pretty cool feature. All right, we're joined here by the famous Ken Zelin from McIntosh Lab. Ken, thanks for joining us. This is a product we've been waiting for forever. We're super excited. I know you were probably intricately involved in making this happen, so thank you for that.
Yeah, we've been asking for this product since 1979, I think. That's when the C32 preamp had an equalizer, and everyone said they should make that as a separate model.
Yeah, for sure. So in this call, I'd love to cover some of the history on equalizers from McIntosh and kind of share with the viewers the design intent, how to use it, when to use it, what it's best for. And I know it's got some sort of tricks up its sleeve, so I'd love to know about how it's triggered and best ways to connect it. So how did it come about? Tell us where it started.
Well, McIntosh's first equalizer years ago was the MQ101 and 102. And those weren't really room equalizers. Those were really designed for a specific speaker. the first speakers McIntosh produced. When you design a speaker, there's a little bit of a compromise between how deep it goes in the bass and how clear the bass is and the efficiency. So they designed a speaker that would go really deep in the bass, have really low distortion, but have a predictable lack of bass. And then you'd buy the MQ101 or 102 equalizer to add to your system, which restored the bass that the speaker lacked. And that way you'd get the deep bass, the clear bass, the low distortion, and the right amount of bass. At least we thought. That didn't work out as we thought. We started getting calls from people saying that the bass was boomy if they added the equalizer. So McIntosh developed something called an AA1, and that was an acoustic analyzer that would measure rooms. And in the Boston area, we worked with a dealer. I was actually working at that store, Stereo Shop of Massachusetts, in Newton, Massachusetts. And we would go out during the week and offer to measure people's stereo systems at no charge to them. And we started measuring people's stereos and discovered that rooms have this huge effect on the sound. I mean, you can have a 35 decibel peak in the bass. So all this careful measuring and designing of the speaker in our anechoic test chamber and this MQ101 equalizer, which provided exactly the right amount of bass boost, it wasn't doing what we were expecting because we forgot to put the room into the equation fully. And every room is completely different. We also ran into a problem back then. There was a certain brand of speaker who I won't mention because they're still in business and they like to sue people. But there was a certain brand of speaker made in Massachusetts that we would test, and we would feed 20 hertz into the speaker, and it would produce nothing but distortion at 40 hertz. And the meter on our analyzer would read the speaker as doing perfectly well. It would read 0 dB. So we had to redesign the acoustic analyzer, and they developed the AA2, which made us be able to test only the frequency that was being fed to the speaker. It didn't read other stuff that was coming out. What came out of that were the MQ104 and the 107, and those were 4 and 7 band equalizers that were designed to take care of your room. The new version of that is called the MEN220, and we've produced that for a number of years. That's a room equalizer designed to take care of boom in the bass, or your room is absorbing too much at another frequency. It also takes care of the asymmetry in most rooms. So most rooms are not the same on the right and left side. So the left speaker might be producing more bass, and the right speaker might be producing more mid-range in your room. And maybe the left speaker's next to glass, which is reflecting the highs. So now when Diana Krall sings, her voice is going from the left to the right to the left as the pitch changes.
So that's why you see in pro audio equalizers that have bands for the left channel independently from the right channel, right? Which is not the direction you've chosen to go here.
Yeah. So what we are producing with the MQ112 is something completely different. It doesn't take care of room imperfections. We've already got a device to do that.
Right.
But there's a lot of rooms that just have a boom in the bass. There's a lot of recordings that don't sound right.
Okay.
And especially if you like older recordings, like Diamonds and Rust. Spectacular recording done years ago. But she sounds, when she's singing, like she weighs 70 pounds. There's no, the way it was mic'd, there's no richness to the voice, but the music is incredible.
Right.
So years ago, we started putting 5 band equalizers in our preamps. So instead of having bass and treble, you had low bass, mid bass, upper bass, lower mid range, and then a treble high frequency control. So you had much more selectivity. The way I usually describe it is kind of like cooking. If I'm going to make soup, if I decide to make cabbage soup, in goes cabbage, tomatoes, beef, celery, onions, herbs, sugar, and lemon juice, because it's sweet and sour. If you have bass and treble controls, all you can adjust is the sweet and the sour. That's it. So you can't change the soup if you don't like it very much.
Got it.
A 5-band equalizer is like having control of 5 of your ingredients. You can really change the way the soup tastes. And an 8-band equalizer means you got control of all the ingredients. So
you can turn soup into ice cream, essentially.
Pretty much. You can make bad recordings sound better. You can make rooms that absorb bass at a certain frequency, put out more. You can also do something really fun with an equalizer. You can, if you just try to boost the bass on a small speaker, you're going to destroy the speaker because you're going to overdrive the woofer.
Yeah.
You can take an equalizer, an 8-band equalizer, and boost the mid bass and reduce the super deep bass and get much more bass
impact
at the small speaker. And if anyone's got planar speakers, most planar speakers don't have much deep bass. They lack a little in the upper bass, and you can play around with it. So this is a device designed for people who don't have a McIntosh preamp already that has an 8-band equalizer.
Okay. Now, why is it? I've noticed on McIntosh's product line that it's mostly solid state preamps that have equalizers. The tube ones don't. I imagine it has to do with the fact that you want to use solid state devices for the equalization, so it defeats some of the tubeness of it. Is that correct? Can you talk about that?
So it's 2 things happening. I'm going to just mute my phone. Okay. 2 things happening. One is that a lot of people who buy tube equipment don't like tone controls. So it's just a philosophical thing. That's part of it. And it's mostly that you can't do an equalizer with tubes. It would be gigantic.
A lot of tubes. Yeah. Okay.
It would be a lot of tubes. If we put a big solid state section in a tube product, people would say, well, now it's only half tubes.
Yeah.
So traditionally, we only put equalizers on solid state models, but now anyone who's got one of our tube preamps can add the EQ, and the great thing is you can turn it on and off. When you don't want to use it, you don't have to use it.
Yeah. So I've seen this product more geared towards, and I've heard you talk about this before, you'll use the MEN220 to, auto calibrate into a room, get a room under control, but you can use this equalizer to enhance your music experience, right? To save crappy recordings, kind of tear down or take down a notch of some of the things that are too aggressive. So it can be used by genre rather than by system, right?
Oh, absolutely. And in multi-room systems. I had a system in the house in New Jersey, and I wired up a pair of very nice speakers in the ceiling of the kitchen. And the 2 rooms sounded completely different from each other. Well, one room had a rug. In the kitchen, the speakers were firing down onto a granite island we had in the middle of the kitchen. Of course, it's going to sound totally different. So if I were doing a multi-room system with 2 or 3 rooms, I might have an MEN220 for the main room and an MQ112 for each remote room. You can really play around with the tonal balance. That's what this is all about. It's the tonal balance of the system.
Got it. Now, the reason we've been wanting a McIntosh equalizer, our fans are, our client base is generally vintage based, right? They love vintage speakers, and the vintage speakers, they're fun to own, fun to collect. Some are amazing, but they leave something on the table, right? And an equalizer, just like tone controls or loudness control, gives us the ability to kind of get a little bit more umph out of them, right? To kind of tame them or get a little more something extra out of them. And this is really the tool for that job, right? It's not a room corrector. It's really an equalizer.
If I had Altec Lansing speakers or old JBLs or Klipsch Heresies, which they still make. I mean, the Klipsch Heresy has very punchy dynamic bass. It lacks deep bass, but if you just try to turn a bass control up, you can overdrive the woofer because it's boosting up 20 hertz, which that woofer was never designed to produce. So you take the MQ112 and you boost up the 40 to 50 range, and you go, oh, that's fantastic. It sounds richer. Now I'm going to take 20 hertz and turn it down, and you've got more bass out of the speaker, but you're actually protecting the woofer because it's not trying to produce frequencies that it wasn't meant to produce. Anyone who owns Klipsch speakers is going to go
want one of these
over this.
Absolutely. Now, tell me about the tilt knob, right? We're not used to seeing that on hi-fi equipment. We have often seen treble bass controls and loudness. Like, how does a tilt knob work, and why do we have one there?
Okay, that is for you're listening to some source and it's out of balance. It's got too much highs relative to the lows or too much lows relative to the highs. Sometimes when people say my speakers lack highs, it's really because they've got too much bass in their room. So everything's relative. When you don't want to start playing with the 8 bands and you want just a quick fix, you use the tilt. It just shifts the tonal balance, more bass, less highs, more highs, less bass. Diamonds and Rust album, which lacks bass and too much highs. You just do that and it's fixed. So it's a quick experiment control for when you don't want to get involved with the 8 controls.
Versus a loudness control, which would just boost the ends, right? How did that loudness control work?
Okay, that's a different thing. So when we play music loud, we hear relatively flat response. What I mean by that is you can hear highs, mids, and lows equally well when the volume's up. But as the volume of anything decreases, we start not hearing bass well and a little bit less well in the treble. Now, people who are into genetics say that that's a thing so that we can hear voices of other people, but other background sounds won't drive us crazy. That's the theory as to why our ear developed that. Okay. Now, if you always played your music at home at live volumes, loudness buttons would be completely useless. But what often happens is we have to play, especially if you're married, you have to play sometimes your system at a lower volume than you would want because there's other people who are not into your recreating the Doobie Brothers like a live concert. So if the Doobie Brothers was played originally at this volume and in your home you're forced to play it at this volume, you're not going to hear the bass well. So someone years ago said, why don't we come up with a circuit that boosts the bass in the region that the human ear lacks bass response at low volume, so it sounds better at lower volume.
I understand.
That was the theory. Never really worked very well because different songs are at different volumes and different speakers have different efficiency, and it tried to work off the position of the volume control. And it never lived up to the promise. So about 15 years ago, I convinced McIntosh to take loudness controls off of the preamps.
And keep them off.
And keep them off. It's not coming back.
All right. Tell me about the best way to connect this piece, right? Because we've got a few different options depending on their system, whether you use a subwoofer or not, and whether you've got tape loops. How would you decide how to connect this?
Okay. So if you have a tape loop, which would be called maybe a tape monitor, let's say you've got a C28 preamp or some classic older preamp. And that loop was actually designed originally to connect to cassette or reel-to-reel in, but few people have those anymore. You can put the equalizer in that circuit. So you take the tape record out of the preamp and go into the equalizer. You come out of the equalizer and back into your preamp on the playback input jacks. And that's one way to hook it up.
Right.
Generally speaking, it's not the way I would hook it up. I would connect it between my preamplifier and my power amplifier.
Okay.
Now, that means that you either have to have a separate preamp and amp.
You have separates, yeah.
Or you have to have an integrated amp with jumpers on the back where you can access the pre-out main in.
Which most of them do at this point, right?
Yes. So I'll tell you, since this is mostly going to go to McIntosh owners, that means you can't use it with an MA230 integrated amp. Can't use it with an MA5100. You can't use it with an MA252 or an MA352.
Okay.
But the most likely person to buy the equalizer would be someone with an integrated amp in the price range of a 352, and that's already got an equalizer anyway.
Yeah. So
not a big problem.
Yeah. Okay.
Any of the other integrated amps we've ever made have the jacks that we need. Now,
so you pull the little jumpers and you loop in and out of those connections. That's the one way to do it.
Now, there's several other advantages of doing it between the preamp and amp as opposed to doing it in a tape loop. And that is, a lot of people have subwoofers. And what you really want to do is connect your subwoofer so that the equalizer will affect both the main speakers and the subwoofer.
Right.
And you don't want the equalizer to overload. Now, in the past, we had a problem with equalizers. If anyone used to own equalizers of the past, if you put them between your preamp and your amp, you would run into a problem because they would overload. A lot of amps can require up to 2.5 volts of input. And equalizers years ago used to overload if you put more than 1 volt into them. So some of those old McIntosh equalizers even had a switch to prevent overload. It's called input attenuation. And if anyone out there ever had the original Advent equalizer, the FBS, I think it was, frequency balancing system, that thing had not only noise, but it would overload at 1 volt. So our engineers on this is Pete did this model. He wanted to get it as overload proof as possible. And he was very successful. Let's just take a quick peek. If we look at the specs on this equalizer, it can handle 10 volts on its input, and it can output up to 10 volts with no distortion.
Which is a crazy number for a preamp.
It's crazy. You're never going to give it 10 volts. So there's no reason not to hook it up between your preamp and your amp. Now,
Okay.
on the back of it, and you'll show the back later. On the back of it, it has a pair of inputs, both balanced and unbalanced, but it's got two sets of outputs.
Mm-hmm.
So that means you can connect one set of outputs to your power amplifier and one set of outputs to a subwoofer.
Mm-hmm.
And now it's going to affect both the same.
Correct.
And that's a great feature. Also, for anyone who's bi-amplifying, using separate amps for the highs and lows, they can take the pre-out, go into this, and then come out of this to the two power amplifiers. Right. Now it gets better. If you've got a subwoofer with only one input, some of the clip subwoofers only have one input. Right. You can flip a switch on this and make the second output mono, so you only need to run one cable into the subwoofer.
Okay.
And then the other thing is that this has all balanced and unbalanced ins and outs, and you can mix and match in any combination. Now, you'd say at first, why would someone want that? Well, they just bought a new MC275 amp that they're going to use to power the mids and highs. And they've got a 7270 power amp, which we made 20 years ago, that doesn't have balanced ins.
Right.
So you can use any combination of balanced or unbalanced ins or outs any way you want. So this is a balanced to unbalanced and an unbalanced to balanced converter on top of everything else.
I assume with level matching as well, we're going to have similar voltages through all of them.
Well, it doesn't have, it'll put out unity gain on both.
Right.
So
okay.
If you're bi-amplifying, you always need to make sure at least one of your amps has gain controls.
Okay. Terrific. And also tell me about the trigger. Is there the ability to put this in line and remove it from the signals from the remote?
Yes, so there's two triggers. One is for power control. So this will just automatically turn on and off with your system. So that's nice. Then on the front, there's a knob that says EQ in, EQ bypass, EQ trigger. And if someone has any one of a variety of our recent preamp models, for instance, with programmable triggers, or even some of our older preamps that didn't have programmable triggers, but they had output 1 and output 2 triggers on it. So we can then make it so your remote control that is with your preamp will allow you to turn the EQ on and off. For instance,
from your listening share. Yeah, that's brilliant.
And because you probably want a different sound. Maybe you've got it set up so TV sounds great. Here's two examples. When I watch TV, I want more bass than when I listen to music. And if I'm 66 now, when I hit age 70, maybe my hearing will start to go a little bit, and I'll have trouble understanding the voices in movies. Okay. This happens all the time. THX calls it dialogue intelligibility problems. It's a fancy way of saying I can't understand the words, I'm getting old.
Yeah.
So this has a control at around 1500 hertz that you can turn up, and it brings the voices forward so you can really hear them. Most of our recent preamps have triggers that you can set for specific inputs. So now you can go even further. Instead of having to press a button on the remote to turn the EQ on and off, you can even program it so when you watch TV, it turns on. But when you switch to your music server, it's bypassed. So there's a lot of automation that you can do with this.
Now, we dabbled on this before and you weren't that keen on it, but could someone potentially use two of these equalizers to get a left channel and right channel equalization independent from each other? What would it take, and would it work, first of all?
Okay. Well, you could do that. I don't want to say no.
Well, will it work?
Well, it depends on what you're trying to. You see, at that point, you're not playing with the recording, because I've never heard a recording that lacked, say,
Right, left
lower
right
mid
channel.
range
Right.
only on the left channel.
That's a good point.
If you're trying to equalize a room, I like to use our MEN220. That's a room correction system. Right. And the great thing about the MEN220 is what it improves mostly is imaging. And people who've never used one say, why would it improve imaging? What it does is it gets your two channels to have exactly the same frequency response. And as soon as you do that, the image stays right in the middle. It doesn't keep shifting back and forth. Right. So I would always use an MEN220 to try to flatten my room. Now, after you have the MEN220 in, it assumes all your recordings are perfect. Would I add an MQ112 on top of that to play with music that wasn't recorded to my liking, or classic recordings? Absolutely. And because the MQ112 has very carefully tracked to each little level control, is very high precision, so that what it does to the left channel, it does exactly the same to the right. It's not going to mess up your imaging.
Yeah, absolutely. I know
if we tried to use two of these, A, you'd probably go crazy, and B, even if you didn't, you'd probably mess up your imaging.
Understood. Terrific. Okay, I also saw in the manual, there's a really neat graphic illustrating the instruments and how they're affected by each of the 8 knobs. I'm going to post a picture of that here so everyone can see it. And that'll, I like that a lot. It's kind of a real world scenario of how you can affect things.
Do you have a copy of my training on the MQ112 yet?
I do. I'll link it below for everybody.
Perfect. I've got a section in that describes what each control really does.
That's great.
I have to say, this is just one of the most fun products we've ever made. Because
it really is.
Yep, half of my recordings I'm just like, what was the engineer thinking? And it's because some engineers use tannoy speakers, and some use JBL speakers, and some use Yamaha speakers, and some use Sonus Faber speakers. And
it's perfect. It's perfect for us as a vintage shop. Our viewers, this is what they want. It's really selling super well. We've had tons of orders. We've sold them before it even came out, and I think it's, for us at least, it's been the most successful product launch.
And one other thing I'll mention is the distortion level is guaranteed to be a maximum of 0.005%. So the question I get over and over again is, will it degrade the performance of my system? And the answer is no.
Yeah. And that's the beauty of the trigger cable, right? For the purist that is sort of on a borderline between wanting and not wanting the product, you can defeat it with a push of a button, right? So on the recordings that desperately need it, you're going to benefit from it. And if you feel that you're missing out on some purity, you can just click a button and away it goes, right? It completely disappears from the signal path.
Exactly. Yep. Just, you're going to use this. Everyone's going to use this more than they ever thought they would.
I agree. Well, thank you so much, Ken. It's been a real blast talking to you. Thanks for this wonderful product. I can't wait to see what McIntosh has coming next. They're incredibly prolific, you guys. I can't believe how many products you put out over a single year. I don't know how you do that with the amount of staff that you have, but congratulations.
Thank you.
And thanks for joining us today.
My pleasure. Take care. Bye-bye.
All right, taking a cover off, we see very typical McIntosh build quality and layout. Starting from this side over here, we've got the power input section. This is the operational relay. This looks to be a transformer, probably for the standby or for the 12-volt triggers, one of the two. Moving on here, we've got the R-core transformer, beautiful piece here. Glass epoxy boards throughout. butted against the all the connectors. You see all the switching functions here. These are their reed type relays that they use in all their gear. It makes a very faint ticking noise when it engages and disengages. Very satisfying. Very nice relays for essentially switching. This is the rest of the power supply here with filtration. And then moving over here, it looks like they've put all the audio controls in the front of the unit, which is a good placement far away from all the noisy bits in the back. So over here we see the same type of PC board. All these little green LEDs is what gives us the backlighting. And they use a ton of them to get nice uniformity throughout the display, which we like. Some of the older stuff was kind of blotchy, but they've really nailed it in recent years in terms of using LEDs in bulk. They were using a fiber optic system at some point that was super complex, but now it's landed in a really nice place, and the color matching between the units is great because we hate having any differences as we mix and match models. So these are all the capacitors and resistors involved in the changing of the signal, including these resistive networks here. And these are all the op amps that give you that functionality. Rotary encoders, actually this one seems to be a real switch, and this one as well. So they're not encoders, they're actually switches. So again, if you want one of these beauties, contact your local McIntosh dealer. I'm sure they'll be able to help you out. And also visit our website at skyfiaudio.com. There is a place at the bottom of the site that allows you to subscribe to our newsletter, which we send twice a week with all the new and cool gear that's arrived. I'd appreciate it if you joined us, if you give us a thumbs up and like and subscribe to our channel. It's a lot of fun making these videos for you, and I hope to be able to continue. And your support goes a long way in making sure of that. So thanks again, skyfiaudio.com. Stay in touch.